At what was supposed to be a celebratory family dinner, my daughter-in-law slapped me hard across the face, calling me selfish for not handing over my inheritance. My son just sighed and their friends chuckled. My cheek burned, but a cold calm settled over me. They thought they had everything figured out, but they hadn't seen the end of my story. Like, share, and let me know where you're listening from. The moment the elevator doors parted, revealing Daniel and Tiffany's apartment door, a familiar knot tightened in Eleanor's stomach. It wasn't the usual anticipatory nervousness of visiting her son. It was a deeper, colder premonition, a sense that tonight was going to be different, and not in a good way. The air in the foyer was thick with an artificial warmth, the kind that masks an underlying chill. Tiffany, draped in a shimmering, undeniably expensive emerald green dress that seemed to cost more than Eleanor's entire monthly pension, swept forward. Her smile, wide and blinding, didn't quite reach her eyes. "Eleanor, darling, our favorite benefactor has arrived," she cooed, her voice saccharine, drawing out the last word with an emphasis that made Eleanor's skin prickle. It was a term Tiffany had adopted ever since Eleanor's late husband Richard had passed away, leaving Eleanor a substantial inheritance. Daniel, her 35-year-old son, barely lifted his head from his phone. He was reclined on their plush velvet sofa, scrolling through something that apparently held more importance than his mother's presence. A grunt of acknowledgement was all she received. Eleanor felt a familiar pang of disappointment, quickly suppressed. She had learned long ago not to expect too much from Daniel, especially when Tiffany was around. Her hands, already trembling slightly from the anxiety of the evening, clutched the ceramic dish containing her homemade apple pie. It was a recipe Richard had loved, a comforting, familiar scent amidst the perfumed extravagance of Tiffany's living room. She placed it carefully on the ornate dining table, which was already laden with an array of exotic appetizers and champagne flutes. "Tonight, we're not just having dinner, Eleanor," Tiffany announced, gliding back towards her, a predatory gleam in her perfectly made-up eyes. "We're celebrating. Celebrating your generosity." The word hung in the air, a thinly veiled expectation. Eleanor looked around the room. Scattered around the opulent space were three other couples, Tiffany's business partners and their wives, all impeccably dressed, all smiling politely, their gazes flicking toward Eleanor with an unnerving intensity. They seemed to be studying her, assessing her, as if she were a prize cow being paraded for inspection. The implication was clear. This was not a casual family dinner. This was a performance, and Eleanor was the main act. Tiffany clapped her hands together, a sound surprisingly sharp. "And speaking of generosity, Eleanor, I have some wonderful news. I've decided to finally treat myself to that plastic surgery I've been dreaming of since baby Lucas was born. $45,000, a real investment in my postpartum body, don't you think?" She winked at her friends, who murmured in agreement. "And then, of course, we absolutely must have a proper vow renewal ceremony. The courthouse thing was so understated. We're thinking the grand ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton. Something truly magnificent. It'll be around $200,000, but worth every penny for the memories." Eleanor's breath hitched. 45,000, 200,000, her mind reeled. This wasn't a request. It was an announcement, delivered with the casual certainty of someone discussing the weather. Daniel finally looked up from his phone, a smirk playing on his lips. "Exactly, Mom. Something worthy of our status now. Not that pathetic courthouse thing. We deserve to celebrate our love properly. Don't we, Tiff?" He didn't even bother to meet Eleanor's eyes, addressing Tiffany as if his mother were simply a spectator. "That's a lot of money, Mom," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible above the clinking of champagne glasses. The words felt inadequate, swallowed by the sheer audacity of their demands. Tiffany's carefully constructed sweetness cracked. Her smile tightened, and a sharp edge entered her tone. "Money you have, Eleanor, plenty of it, and it's for a good cause. My body, our love, our future. We're still in this tiny apartment, for heaven's sake." She gestured around the spacious, meticulously decorated living room with an air of martyrdom. "She's right, Mom," Daniel added, putting his phone down with a sigh that suggested Eleanor was being tiresome. "This place is beneath us. It's not where people of our caliber belong. We need a penthouse in Manhattan, something truly grand. Tiffany found a place with incredible views, perfect for entertaining. It's time we elevated our lifestyle, don't you think? Eleanor felt the weight of their collective greed pressing down on her, suffocating her. It wasn't just Daniel and Tiffany, it was the silent, expectant stares of the business partners and their wives, their subtle nods of agreement. They were all in on it, a pack of wolves circling their prey. She tried to steady her voice. I, I need to think about this. It's a significant amount. The last vestige of Tiffany's fake sweetness vanished. Her face contorted into a mask of pure indignation. Think? Think about what, Eleanor? You're being selfish by money that isn't even really yours. It's Richard's money, and frankly, you didn't earn it. You didn't deserve it. It should be helping us build a life. Her voice rose with each word, tinged with a vicious entitlement that made Eleanor flinch. You just stumbled into it, old woman, while we've been working tirelessly to create something meaningful. Before Eleanor could even process the cruel words, Tiffany stepped forward, her hand rising with startling speed. The sharp, stinging impact across Eleanor's cheek echoed in the sudden silence of the room. Her head snapped sideways, the force of the blow jarring her senses. A throbbing pain bloomed instantly, and her vision blurred for a moment. She brought a hand to her burning cheek, her fingers meeting the raw, angry heat of the slap. A gasp escaped her lips, not from the pain, but from the shock of the outright physical assault. She looked at Daniel, her son, her hope for some comfort or intervention. He was simply sighing, a theatrical display of irritation, as if she were the one causing a scene. And then she heard it, a low, contemptuous chuckle from one of the wives, followed by another. The room full of strangers and her own son seemed to be laughing at her. The humiliation was a deeper cut than the slap itself. Eleanor stood frozen, her hand pressed against the stinging warmth of her cheek. The echoes of the slap vibrated not just on her skin, but deep within her very being. The room, which had fallen silent for a horrifying beat, began to hum with conversation once more. Plates clinked, wine glasses chimed, and polite laughter resumed, as if Tiffany's violent outburst had been merely an unfortunate momentary disruption, a fly to be swatted away before returning to the pleasant hum of the evening. The business partners and their wives, their faces carefully neutral, went back to their appetizers, not meeting her gaze. Daniel, still looking vexed, picked up his phone again. A cold, hard knot formed in Eleanor's chest. For years she had tolerated, accommodated, and excused. But this was different. This was a physical manifestation of their contempt, laid bare for all to see, and met with indifference by her son and amusement by strangers. Slowly, deliberately, Eleanor's hand dropped from her cheek. With a newfound steadiness that surprised even herself, she reached into her purse. Her fingers, usually clumsy with age, moved with a decisive purpose as she retrieved her phone. Her gaze swept across the room, lingering for a moment on Tiffany's triumphant smirk, then on Daniel's averted face. They were oblivious, caught up in their own self-serving world. She scrolled through her contacts, found the name, and pressed call. The phone rang 3 times before a crisp, professional voice answered. Ms. Evelyn Reed, how can I help you? Evelyn, Eleanor's voice was remarkably steady, betraying none of the turmoil raging within her. It's Eleanor Vance. I need you to come to Daniel and Tiffany's apartment. And please, bring all the papers. You know the ones. There was a pause on the other end, a beat of understanding that needed no further explanation. Understood, Eleanor. I'll be there as soon as possible. Give me 30 minutes. Thank you, Evelyn, Eleanor said, and then with a click, she ended the call. She placed the phone face down on the polished surface of the dining table. The simple action resonated through the room, cutting through the renewed chatter like a sharp knife. This time, the silence that fell was not just an interruption. It was charged, dangerous, thick with unspoken questions. Every eye in the room was now fixed on Eleanor. Tiffany, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and something else, perhaps a flicker of unease, pointed a manicured finger at the phone. Who was that, Eleanor? What was that about? Her voice was still sharp, but a hint of tremor betrayed her. Eleanor met her gaze, her own eyes, usually soft and yielding, now held a steely glint. That, she stated, her voice clear and resonant in the sudden quiet, was my attorney. A ripple of murmurs went through the room. Daniel finally lifted his head, his eyes wide with surprise, a flicker of genuine concern replacing his earlier indifference. But Eleanor ignored them all. As the seconds ticked by, waiting for Ms. Reed's arrival, Eleanor's mind drifted, untethered from the present, back into the long, winding corridors of her past. She thought of Richard Vance, her late husband. He had been a good provider, meticulous with finances, ensuring they always had a comfortable home, food on the table, and a secure future. But he was also emotionally distant, a man whose love was expressed through a ledger, not a touch or a kind word. His focus had always been on financial responsibility, on tangible assets, leaving little room for the emotional nuances of a relationship. Eleanor remembered raising Daniel, largely alone, in a house that felt both full and empty. She was the one who went to every school play, cheering from the back row. She was the one who drove him to soccer games, patching up scraped knees and offering comfort after losses. Richard was always working, always busy, always focused on the next big deal. For her generation, this was simply accepted. Wives took on the emotional labor, nurturing the family while husbands provided. But the acceptance didn't erase the daily loneliness, the slow, creeping sensation of becoming invisible within her own life, a supporting character in a story that wasn't hers. When Richard died, it was a complex tapestry of emotions that settled over Eleanor. There was grief, of course, for the loss of a shared history, for the man who had been her partner for so many decades. But beneath the grief, a quiet, almost shameful sense of relief bloomed. Relief to finally breathe in her own home, to make decisions without consulting a ledger or a dismissive shrug. The house, once a monument to Richard's carefully curated life, now felt like her own sanctuary. Then Daniel had stepped in. Her son, her only child, had presented himself as her protector, her guide through the daunting world of post-widowhood finances. He had been so solicitous, so caring initially. He advised her on investments, introduced her to his trusted financial advisor, a smooth-talking man who always had a comforting smile and an array of complex charts. Eleanor, trusting her son implicitly, had signed whatever papers were put in front of her. She remembered Daniel saying something about simplifying things, about ensuring her future was secure. She had nodded, trusting. She didn't fully grasp the legal jargon, but she trusted Daniel. She had unknowingly signed papers that made Daniel the primary beneficiary on everything, giving him significant control, believing it was all for her own good, a way to ease her burden. After that, his attitude had subtly, then overtly, changed. The caring son transformed into a manager, treating her less like a mother and more like a resource to be managed, a fund to be tapped. Every conversation, it seemed, revolved around money. He'd call, not to ask how she was, but to inquire about the market or to subtly hint at some expense he had. She recalled countless small requests, a little extra for rent, a loan for utilities, funds for a spontaneous vacation he and Tiffany desperately needed. Each time, Eleanor had felt a familiar pang of guilt for having this inheritance, this unearned money, while her son supposedly struggled. She felt obligated to help him, to ease his burden, to show him she still cared, even if he rarely showed the same care in return. She had been trapped in a cycle of giving, of trying to buy back the affection she felt she was losing. Tiffany, Eleanor now realized with chilling clarity, hadn't created Daniel's ugly sense of entitlement. She had merely amplified it, poured gasoline on a smoldering ember. But tonight, the slap, the open contempt, the chuckles from the guests, and most painfully, Daniel's indifferent sigh, had broken something inside Eleanor. A line had been crossed, a barrier shattered. The invisible woman was finally ready to be seen. The silence that had fallen over the room after Eleanor's stark announcement was abruptly shattered by the insistent chime of the doorbell. It rang twice, a sharp, clear sound that made everyone freeze. Tiffany, who had been hovering near the kitchen entrance, her face now a shade paler than before, practically jumped. Daniel's fork, which he had been nervously tapping against his plate, clattered loudly as it slipped from his grasp and hit the porcelain. Eleanor, however, remained perfectly composed. She didn't flinch, didn't startle. Instead, she offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. "That would be my attorney," she announced, her voice calm and steady, utterly devoid of the tremor that had plagued her earlier. Daniel, his face now a mask of genuine alarm, finally spoke, his voice cracking slightly. "Mom, why do you need a lawyer? This is just family." He looked bewildered, as if the concept of legal intervention in their private dinner party was utterly alien to him. Eleanor didn't answer him. She simply turned and walked towards the apartment door. She moved with a quiet dignity, her gaze passing over the shocked faces of her son and daughter-in-law, past the uncomfortable, fidgeting guests who now looked decidedly out of place amidst the escalating tension. Each step she took felt lighter, freer than the last. The weight that had pressed upon her for so long seemed to dissipate with every stride. When she reached the door, she opened it without hesitation. Standing on the threshold was Ms. Evelyn Reed. Eleanor's attorney was a woman of commanding presence, even in her sensible tailored suit. Her silver hair was pulled back in a sleek, elegant chignon, and her sharp, intelligent eyes missed nothing. She exuded an aura of confidence and authority that seemed to fill the already crowded foyer. "Eleanor," Ms. Reed greeted her client, her voice a warm, reassuring balm. She reached out and gently squeezed Eleanor's arm. "I came as quickly as I could. I think it's time." Her words were simple, yet imbued with a profound understanding, a shared history of unspoken grievances that Eleanor had confided in her over recent weeks. Ms. Reed then stepped into the apartment, her sharp eyes sweeping across the lavish living room. She took in the lingering tension, the awkward smiles of the guests, the pale faces of Daniel and Tiffany. She read the atmosphere of barely contained panic with the swift efficiency of a seasoned professional. Nothing escaped her notice. With a pleasant, yet firm smile, Ms. Reed turned to address the room. "Good evening, everyone. My name is Evelyn Reed, and I'm Eleanor Vance's attorney." She paused, letting the statement hang in the air, allowing it to sink in. "I understand there's been some discussion this evening about inheritance matters." Her tone was polite, almost conversational, but the underlying steel was unmistakable. Daniel, finally finding his voice again, tried to protest. He stood up from the sofa, agitated. "Ms. Reed, with all due respect, this is a family matter. We don't need lawyers involved in something so personal." He looked desperately at his mother, as if pleading with her to send the formidable woman away. Ms. Reed turned her gaze to Daniel, a faint, almost imperceptible arch of her elegant eyebrow. Her smile didn't waver, but it hardened slightly. "Oh, but you do, Mr. Vance. In fact, you very much do." Without another word, she set down her sleek leather briefcase on the gleaming marble coffee table directly in front of Daniel and Tiffany. The click of the latches was unnervingly loud in the quiet room. From within, she retrieved a stack of thick manila folders. Each one was labeled with neat, precise handwriting, the kind that promised meticulous detail and undeniable facts. Eleanor could see her own name, Richard's name, and even Daniel's name on some of the tabs. So Reed held up the first folder, her gaze sweeping across the tense faces in the room. "Eleanor called me tonight because she feels there have been some rather significant misconceptions regarding her financial situation. Misconceptions that, I gather," she paused, her eyes briefly flicking towards Tiffany's still reddened cheek before meeting Tiffany's eyes directly, "seemed to have led to some rather inappropriate behavior." Tiffany blanched. The last traces of her earlier defiance evaporated, replaced by a mixture of fear and confusion. "Misconceptions?" she stammered, her voice done. "What kind of misconceptions?" She looked at Eleanor, then back at Ms. Reed, her eyes darting nervously. Ms. Reed merely offered another small, tight smile. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she slowly, deliberately opened the first folder. The stage was set, the audience was captive, and the truth, long suppressed, was about to be unveiled. The air crackled with anticipation, a heavy stillness settling over the room as everyone waited for the first document to be revealed, to lay bare the foundations of their assumptions and the consequences of their actions. Ms. Reed held the first document aloft, her gaze sweeping the stunned faces of Daniel, Tiffany, and their guests. A small, knowing smile played on her lips. "Well, for starters," she began, her voice crisp and clear, "there's the rather pervasive belief that Mrs. Vance is simply a wealthy widow, recently coming into money after her husband's passing." Daniel, still reeling from the shock of his mother bringing an attorney into their home, tried to interject, his voice lacking its usual conviction. She is, though. Dad left her everything. Ms. Reed merely raised an eyebrow, a gesture that conveyed both amusement and a hint of condescension. She then lowered the document slightly, allowing everyone to see the bold title at the top. This, Mr. Vance, she stated, is a certificate of incorporation for Patterson Holdings, LLC, filed in Delaware 28 years ago, specifically in '96. A hush fell over the room, deeper and more profound than any before. Daniel's jaw went slack. He stared at the document, then back at his mother, then at Ms. Reed, his eyes darting frantically, trying to process the information. The sole owner and managing member of Patterson Holdings, LLC, clearly typed for all to see, was Eleanor Jean Vance. "Silence, please," Ms. Reed commanded softly, yet with an authority that brooked no argument. "Your mother," she continued, her voice now softer, but no less impactful, "didn't just inherit money, Mr. Vance. She's been building her own fortune for nearly 3 decades. She began to recount the story, a narrative that was utterly alien to Daniel and Tiffany. Eleanor had, in fact, used $15,000 from Daniel's college fund, a sum she had meticulously saved herself, separate from Richard's contributions, to make her very first property investment back in '90s. Reed quickly added, almost as an aside, that the college fund had, of course, been replaced, and then some, years before Daniel even started applying to universities. Eleanor, listening to her attorney, found herself drifting back to that time. She vividly recalled the small, dilapidated 3-story apartment building in a quiet corner of Queens, the one she had bought for $65,000. Richard had scoffed at her ambition, had called it a foolish venture, a distraction from her duties as a wife and mother. He'd barely noticed the hours she spent poring over books on real estate, the late nights spent researching zoning laws and market trends. Ms. Reed continued, detailing Eleanor's tireless efforts. "She didn't hire contractors for every little thing, Mr. Vance. Your mother, Eleanor, learned how to fix leaky pipes from YouTube. She taught herself basic electrical wiring, how to plaster walls, how to paint, how to manage tenants. She was on site almost every day after you left for school, transforming that property with her own 2 hands. Daniel, his brow furrowed in confusion, finally managed to stammer, "Mom, you never told me about any building, any of this." His voice was a barely audible whisper, a childish plea in the face of this overwhelming revelation. Eleanor looked at him then, a soft, sad smile gracing her lips. "You never asked, sweetheart," she replied, her voice gentle, yet imbued with a lifetime of unspoken truth. "You were always too busy with your father, or your friends, or your phone. I mentioned it once or twice, but you always waved it off. Your father always waved it off. It was just Eleanor's little hobby." Ms. Reed took over again, allowing the quiet truth of Eleanor's words to settle. The income from that first building, which she managed herself, meticulously reinvested, led to a second property, then a third. Slowly, steadily, brick by brick, she built an empire. By the time Richard Vance passed away, Eleanor didn't just have a few rental units. She owned 17 rental properties, spread across 3 boroughs of New York City. The number 17 properties hit the room like a series of hammer blows. The guests exchanged wide-eyed glances. Tiffany, who had been staring blankly, suddenly seemed to snap out of her stupor. Her eyes widened, and a rapid, almost frantic series of calculations began to flicker across her face. 17 properties in New York City, the rental income alone, the market value. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly. The dawning realization was a stark, brutal blow. She had seen Eleanor as a naive, simple old woman, a mere recipient of Richard's fortune. She had viewed her as a convenient, easily manipulated source of cash. But 17 properties? That wasn't just wealthy, that was seriously, independently, formidably rich. Tiffany's face, already pale, now drained of all color, showing the profound, humiliating extent of her complete and utter misunderstanding of Eleanor's true financial standing. The architect of her own fortune had been sitting right under their noses, dismissed, belittled, and now publicly shamed by them. If you're finding Eleanor's story as surprising as Daniel and Tiffany are, make sure to keep watching. Like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe so you don't miss any part of this incredible journey. The truth is still unfolding, and you won't believe what happens next. Ms. Reed paused, allowing the gasps and murmurs ignited by the revelation of 17 properties to subside. The room was buzzing with a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. Tiffany, in particular, looked as if she'd been struck by lightning, her earlier calculations of rental income now morphing into something far grander and more terrifying for her. But that's not all, Ms. Reed continued, her voice cutting through the whispers with an almost theatrical flair. She reached into her briefcase again, pulling out a series of glossy reports and legal documents. Eleanor's entrepreneurial spirit didn't stop at real estate. While you, Mr. Vance, were focused on your high-stakes corporate ventures, your mother was quietly diversifying her portfolio. She laid out the next set of papers. Eleanor also invested in several small businesses, nurturing them from their nascent stages. There was a single food truck she backed, which has since grown into a thriving chain of artisanal sandwich restaurants across the city. She paused, letting that sink in. Then there was a modest cleaning service, a woman-owned business, which under Eleanor's guidance and capital, expanded into a highly successful commercial janitorial company, servicing some of the biggest corporate offices in Manhattan. The collective astonishment in the room deepened. The business partners, once so dismissive, now looked genuinely impressed, if not slightly intimidated. But Ms. Reed wasn't finished. And perhaps most notably, she added, her eyes twinkling slightly, Eleanor was an early investor in a promising tech startup, a company that developed an innovative, user-friendly app designed specifically to connect seniors with essential services and community resources. It's now valued at several $1,000,000. She then produced a thick, leather-bound portfolio, placing it with a deliberate thud on the pristine glass coffee table. The weight of it seemed to reverberate through the silent room. "Would you like to see the current valuation, Daniel?" Ms. Reed asked, her tone deceptively polite. Daniel, speechless and pale, could only nod mutely. He looked like a puppet whose strings had been cut, his earlier arrogance entirely replaced by a profound, disbelieving shock. His eyes, wide and unfocused, seemed to be searching for an escape route, a way to rewind the last hour and erase all that had been said. Ms. Reed opened the portfolio with a flourish, turning it to face Daniel and Tiffany. A single figure, circled prominently in bold red ink, stood out on the page. $8. $7 million, she announced, her voice resonating through the silent apartment. That is the current estimated total valuation of Patterson Holdings, LLC, encompassing all real estate assets, business investments, and liquid capital. The room erupted again, this time in louder, more incredulous whispers. $8.7 million, someone breathed. Impossible, another guest muttered. But Eleanor, unmoved by the collective astonishment, kept her gaze fixed on Daniel and Tiffany's stunned faces. Daniel finally found his voice, a raw, strangled sound. $8 million, Mom, that's impossible. How? When? He looked at her as if she were a stranger, a puzzle he could no longer comprehend. Eleanor met his gaze directly, her voice calm and steady, tinged with a lifetime of quiet disappointment. "Did you think I was incapable of learning, Daniel? Of growing? Of becoming more than just your father's wife? Did you truly believe my only value was as a silent ornament in his life? Or now as a convenient source of funds for yours?" Tiffany, her face ashen, finally managed to articulate a thought, albeit a self-serving one. "Why didn't you tell us, Eleanor? All this time we thought you were just living off Richard's pension. We thought you needed our help to manage your affairs. We thought you were struggling." Her voice ended in a desperate, almost pathetic plea. Eleanor shook her head, a loud, knowing smell on her lips. "No, Tiffany, you didn't think I was struggling. You thought I was helpless. You thought I was some doddering old widow who got lucky with an inheritance. You saw me as a means to an end, a bottomless ATM for your desires, never once considering I might have my own life, my own ambitions, my own hard-earned wealth." As the weight of Eleanor's words settled heavy and undeniable, Ms. Reed cleared her throat, drawing everyone's attention once more. "And there's more, I'm afraid," she added, her voice holding a note of ominous finality. Daniel looked like he might actually be sick, His hand instinctively went to his stomach. More, he choked out, his eyes wide with a mixture of dread and disbelief. The carefully constructed world he and Tiffany had built, predicated on Eleanor's supposed vulnerability and their entitlement to her inherited wealth, was crumbling around them, revealing a towering, unshakable empire of which they had been utterly unaware. The true extent of Eleanor's independence and capability was now undeniably clear, a stark contrast to the persona they had so cruelly assigned her. The atmosphere in the apartment was now thick with an almost unbearable tension. Daniel and Tiffany, along with their guests, were reeling from the shocking revelation of Eleanor's independent wealth. But Ms. Reed, ever the professional, was not yet finished. She allowed a moment for the murmurs to subside, then cleared her throat once more. "There's one more clarification I need to make," she stated, her voice taking on a slightly sterner tone. "Beyond building her own significant fortune, Eleanor has also been your, shall we say, anonymous benefactor for the past 5 years." A collective gasp went through the room. Daniel and Tiffany looked utterly bewildered, then defensive. "What are you talking about?" Daniel blurted out, a panicked edge to his voice. Ms. Reed calmly pulled out another meticulously organized folder. "Let's start with your apartment, Mr. Vance. This rather tiny apartment you find beneath your status?" She held up a document. "The lease, I'm afraid to inform you, is not in your name, nor in Miss Tiffany's. It's held by one of Eleanor's LLCs, specifically Queen's Properties LLC." Daniel's face, already pale, went utterly white. He stared at the document, then at his mother, his mouth agape, unable to form a single coherent word. "What?" he finally managed, the sound barely a breath. "Indeed, what?" Mrs. Reed echoed, a hint of something akin to pity in her voice. "Since 2019, Eleanor has been quietly paying your rent. That's $1,200 a month for 60 months, totaling precisely $72,000. She paused, letting the numbers hang in the air, each digit a tiny hammer blow to Daniel's carefully constructed ego. Tiffany's eyes, which had been fixed on the document, now snapped to Daniel, then to Eleanor. Her hands, resting on the back of Daniel's dining chair, gripped the wood so tightly her knuckles turned white. "And that sleek BMW you drive, Mr. Vance?" says. Reed continued, pulling out another document. "The one you so proudly show off to your colleagues and friends? It's not leased by you. It's registered to Patterson Holdings. Eleanor has been making the $650 monthly payments on that vehicle for the past 3 years. That's an additional $23,400. Tiffany's grip on the chair tightened further, her knuckles now stark white against the dark wood. She finally found her voice, a thin, reedy sound, barely recognizable. "You've been paying for everything." Eleanor, who had remained silent during Ms. Reed's pronouncements, finally spoke, her voice calm and measured. "Not everything, Tiffany. Just the essentials, and some of your more frequent indulgences. Your credit cards, your student loans, various medical bills that cropped up. Those I paid directly through separate transfers. I made sure to spread the payments across different accounts so you wouldn't notice a pattern. I didn't want you to worry about mundane financial details while you were busy building your careers, building your status." Ms. Reed nodded, confirming Eleanor's words with a nod. She began listing, almost clinically, the litany of expenses that Eleanor had quietly covered. The Nordstrom shopping sprees, the expensive dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, that luxurious European trip you took last summer, the one you boasted about endlessly on social media, all of it covered by Eleanor, without a single word, without a single expectation of gratitude. Her voice hardened slightly. "Your mother has been covering your entire lavish lifestyle for years, creating the illusion of your success, and you never once thanked her. You never even suspected." The weight of these cumulative revelations settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. Daniel and Tiffany, once so confident in their perceived success and Eleanor's boundless inheritance, were now left utterly exposed, grappling with the humiliating truth of their financial dependence. Their carefully constructed image of prosperity, of effortless achievement, had been brutally shattered, revealed to be nothing more than an elaborate facade meticulously funded by the very woman they had just slapped and insulted. Daniel, his head bowed, finally managed to whisper, his voice choked with emotion. "Why, Mom, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you just say something?" Eleanor reached out, her hand gently resting on his slumped shoulder. Her touch, usually a source of comfort, now felt heavy with unspoken truths. "Because I wanted you to feel independent, Daniel," she said softly, her eyes filled with a heartbreaking mixture of love and sorrow. "I wanted you to believe in yourself. I wanted you to feel the pride of accomplishment, even if it meant I had to quietly pave the way for you. I wanted you to think you were earning your own success, building your own life." As Eleanor spoke, the last vestiges of Daniel's defiance crumbled. His shoulders began to shake, and silent tears, hot and humiliating, began to fall, tracing paths through the dust of his shattered illusions. He finally understood. His perceived success, his boasted achievements, his lavish lifestyle, and all of it had been an elaborate, heartbreaking illusion, almost entirely funded by the quiet, invisible hand of his mother, the woman he had so carelessly dismissed, the woman he had just allowed to be humiliated. The realization was a bitter, unbearable pill. Eleanor's hand remained on Daniel's shoulder as his tears fell, the quiet sobs a stark contrast to the grand, opulent apartment. Her voice, though soft, carried a new strength, a quiet authority that vibrated through the room. "You are successful, Daniel," she said, her thumb gently caressing his sleeve, "but not in the way you thought, and certainly not successful enough to treat me the way you have been." With that, Ms. Reed closed the thick portfolio on the coffee table with a decisive snap, the sound echoing loudly in the sudden, profound quiet. Her job here was nearing its completion, but not before delivering the final crushing blow. She reached into her briefcase one last time, pulling out a single-page document, official letterhead crisp and undeniable, bearing several important signatures. "Effective immediately," Mr. Reed announced, her voice devoid of emotion. "All support payments from Patterson Holdings LLC and any other associated entities of Eleanor Jean Vance will cease." She looked directly at Daniel, then at Tiffany, her gaze unwavering. "The lease for this apartment, currently held by Queens Properties LLC, will not be renewed next month. You will have 30 days to vacate, and the payments on the BMW will stop tomorrow. The vehicle will need to be returned to the company garage by the end of the week." The silence that followed was absolute, breathtaking. It felt as if the air itself had been sucked out of the room. Not even the distant hum of city traffic dared to intrude. The guests, rigid in their seats, avoided eye contact, their faces a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. Tiffany, her face contorted with panic and rage, finally shrieked, "You can't do that! We have expenses. We have obligations. Our entire business relies on us maintaining a certain image." Eleanor merely looked at her, her expression unyielding. "You have jobs, Tiffany. And Daniel, you also have a job. You're both educated adults. You can figure it out. Just as I did all those years ago when your father scoffed at my little hobby." Daniel, lifting his tear-streaked face, his eyes pleading, "Mom, please, I know we messed up tonight. We were wrong. We can fix this. Please, just don't do this." He tried to reach for her hand, but Eleanor gently withdrew it. "Tonight," Eleanor interrupted, her voice firm. "Tonight was just the culmination, Daniel. It was the final straw. But this has been building for 5 years. 5 years of taking me for granted. 5 years of me watching you both spend money I worked tirelessly for, believing it was your due while you treated me with condescension, with indifference, and finally with outright disrespect and violence." Her hand instinctively went to her still tender cheek. "Tonight I remembered who I am. And who I am is not someone who accepts being treated as less than human or as a mere bank account." Ms. Reed, having delivered her final message, neatly put the documents back into her briefcase. She gave Eleanor a reassuring nod, then turned to the room. "Good evening, everyone," she said, her tone professional once more. She then quietly exited the apartment, leaving a gaping void in her wake. The dinner guests, caught in the awkward, humiliating aftermath, began to stir. Mumbling hurried, uncomfortable goodbyes, they gathered their belongings and made their hasty exits, leaving Daniel and Tiffany alone in the opulent, yet now utterly hollow apartment. The door clicked shut, sealing them in their stunned silence, amidst the remnants of a dinner party gone spectacularly wrong. Daniel finally broke the silence, his voice raw. Mom, can we just talk about all this? He gestured vaguely around the room as if trying to encompass the wreckage of their evening in their relationship. Eleanor looked at him, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. There's not much left to talk about regarding your finances, Daniel, but perhaps there's one more thing you should know. You think I live in a simple apartment in Queens, don't you? A humble dwelling for an old woman? She pulled out her phone, opened her gallery, and presented it to him. On the screen were photos of a sprawling, exquisitely designed penthouse. It wasn't just an apartment, it was an entire floor. That building I bought back in 1996, Eleanor explained softly, her gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of Daniel and Tiffany. The one your father called my little hobby? I eventually bought the entire building. And then, as the original tenants moved out, I started combining units. This, she pointed to a photo of a magnificent living space with panoramic views of the city skyline, is my penthouse. It combines three of the original units. It's where I live, where I entertain my business associates, and where I have my private office. She scrolled through more photos, a sleek, modern office setup with multiple monitors, a luxurious master suite, a gourmet kitchen. I own 7 apartment buildings, Daniel, not just the one, and 12 commercial properties across the city, and as Evelyn mentioned, stakes in 15 different businesses, all generating immense income. I haven't just been managing your father's inheritance, I've been creating my own dynasty. Daniel sat slumped on the velvet sofa, surrounded by the remnants of what should have been a celebratory dinner. The revelation of Eleanor's true wealth, her quiet empire, and her anonymous support had utterly undone him. His voice, still thick with unshed tears, broke the heavy silence. Why, Mom, why didn't you tell me any of this? All these years. Eleanor, standing tall and resolute amidst the wreckage of their assumptions, looked at her son with a complex mixture of pain and resolve. Because I didn't need your help, Daniel, and because I feared you would try to control me, just like your father did. Her gaze hardened slightly. For 42 years, my opinions were dismissed, my capabilities questioned. Everything I achieved outside the home was deemed a hobby. I was Richard's wife, then Daniel's mother. When your father died for the first time in decades, I felt a kind of freedom. The freedom to finally prove to myself, and to anyone who cared to see, that I was more than just a background character in other people's lives. Tiffany, who had been sitting rigidly, her face pale and streaked with tears, finally found her voice. We treated you terribly, Eleanor, she choked out, her usual bravado completely shattered. The things I said tonight, the way I hit you. Her hand instinctively went to her own cheek, as if feeling the phantom sting of her own cruelty. Eleanor fixed her with a steady, unflinching gaze. Are you sorry, Tiffany, because you hurt me? Or are you sorry because you found out I'm worth $8 million and you just lost your golden goose? Tiffany flinched, then after a moment of agonizing silence, she whispered, Both. I'm sorry for both. A flicker of something akin to reluctant credit crossed Eleanor's face. At least that's honest, she conceded, the words devoid of warmth, but not entirely of acknowledgement. Days later, the phone calls began. Tiffany, then Daniel, each pleading, cajoling, apologizing profusely. Eleanor, however, remained unyielding. During a particularly tearful call from Daniel, she calmly reiterated Ms. Reed's points. The payments have stopped, Daniel. The apartment lease is not being renewed. The car will be repossessed if it's not returned. This is not negotiable. She then spoke, not with anger, but with a quiet, firm wisdom. When I was your age, Daniel, I worked double shifts. I saved every penny. I built my life from nothing. And I did it without anyone handing me anything. This isn't about punishing you. This is about recognizing that the dynamic we've had for years, of me supporting you while you take me for granted and treat me with disdain, has been unhealthy for all of us. 6 months later, Ms. Reed provided Eleanor with an update. Daniel and Tiffany, unable to afford their lavish lifestyle without Eleanor's invisible hand, had moved out of their expensive apartment and into Tiffany's parents' suburban home. Daniel had taken on a second job, working evenings and weekends, and Tiffany, surprisingly, had found part-time work at a local boutique. But the most unexpected news came from Daniel's supervisor, who, having been discreetly contacted by Ms. Reed at Eleanor's request purely for professional feedback, reported a complete transformation in work ethic. Daniel was suddenly focused, driven, and committed, no longer distracted by his previously privileged life. This genuinely surprised Eleanor. She hadn't anticipated such a profound shift, only hoped for some self-reliance. Then, one quiet Saturday afternoon, the doorbell rang at Eleanor's penthouse in Queens. It was Daniel. He looked thinner, a little tired, but there was a new, unfamiliar solidity about him, a quiet humility that had never been there before. His eyes, though still a little guarded, held a genuine earnestness. "Mom," he began, his voice raspy, I, I just came to apologize. Not for the money, not for what we lost, but for losing your respect, for not seeing you, really seeing you all these years, for being such a fool." His gaze met hers, and Eleanor saw a flicker of the boy she remembered, the one she had raised. Eleanor reached out, taking his calloused hand in hers. It was the first time she had initiated physical contact with him in years. "It's not too late, Daniel," she said softly, her eyes brimming with a mixture of hope and tenderness. "It's not too late to become someone I can be proud of, someone you can be proud of." They talked for over an hour, sitting on the plush sofa in her penthouse, surrounded by the empire she had built. Daniel listened as Eleanor spoke, not just about her businesses, but about the loneliness, the quiet determination, the joy of achievement she had found in her secret life. And Eleanor listened as Daniel spoke of his fear, his misplaced pride, his dawning realization of the value of hard work. Then, for the first time in years, they hugged. It wasn't the tentative, forced embrace of obligation, but a real, heartfelt hug, born of honesty and a fragile, burgeoning understanding. Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling a profound sense of peace. She was free, strong, and ready for whatever came next. Whether Daniel was a part of her future or not, she had found her own vow, and that was enough.